with, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic on everybody's minds, we have brought together some of the most eminent thinkers in the field of economics, and they are all women. And today, we're not going to give you so much as analysis as to try to reimagine, to rethink, to rebuild our response to the common challenges that have emerged as a result of COVID-19, to see how we can build back better through the lens of inclusion and sustainability. So we're going to be discussing three areas under sort of three broad subjects: external finance, debt, and international trade. We're going to have some opening remarks first, but let me, as an introduction, set the scene with this film that's going to really give us an overview of what the COVID-19 pandemic has meant for the global economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has shaken the world. More than 10 million cases and around 500,000 deaths. And the World Health Organization is warning of a second wave. But what began as a health and humanitarian crisis has become an unprecedented global emergency, threatening lives and livelihoods across continents as national lockdowns and curfews inflict heavy damage on economies. The capacity of governments to respond is being severely tested, especially in lower-income countries. We need rapid assessments of how inequalities, systemic and structural deficiencies make some nations more vulnerable. The UN Secretary-General has said that through our combined, comprehensive and multilateral efforts, we can act to suppress the transmission of the disease and recover. But the world is also presented with a unique opportunity to emerge wiser and stronger based on Agenda 2030 to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals within this decade. Innovative forms of financing are needed to fund a clean and inclusive future. This roundtable series of eminent thinkers, mostly women, has been convened by the Secretary-General and the Deputy Secretary-General. It brings engaging, new and diverse perspectives on present challenges. The COVID-19 crisis affects us all, but it can also unite us with renewed purpose, common vision, and fresh vigour to build back better. It's my pleasure now to invite His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, to launch this roundtable of discussions. Secretary-General.
Dear friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You are all over the world, which is very good. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this first roundtable on rebirthing the global economy to deliver sustainable development. And I believe only a women-led movement could be as far as to say that we need to rebirth the global economy. And I'm very happy with your determination on this. The COVID-19 pandemic and the global recession it has triggered are, of course, causing immense human suffering around the world. And unless we act now, we could face years of depressed and disrupted economic growth. Those who suffer most will be the less equipped to respond. Extreme poverty and anger are set to increase drastically. Healthcare systems in many countries are already at breaking point. And the generation of children is missing out on their education. The pandemic threatens not just to put the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development on hold, but to reverse progress that has already been made. And that is why, since the beginning of the crisis, I've been calling for a rescue package amounting to at least 10% of the global economy. It is interesting to see that developed countries are basically doing it with their own resources or printing money when their currencies can be accepted in all circumstances, as this is the case of our host country here. But the problem is to make sure that developing countries will have the resources or will be provided with the resources to be able to have similar packages to rescue their economies. Now, 4 weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Jamaica and Canada, Jamaica and Canada are the two countries that lead the group of friends of financing sustainable development. The three of us convened global leaders to identify ways to finance the recovery and to build back better. Representatives from different countries, about 50 heads of state and government, have now stepped forward to lead an effort that brings together governments, international financial institutions, and United Nations agencies, private sector creditors, and more. They are examining options to address key challenges from global liquidity and debt vulnerability to eroding illicit financial flows and recovering better. And we need concrete, radical, and implementable solutions. And I hope that this series of roundtables will make an enormous difference, stimulating new ideas and a totally different debate in relation to the classic ones we have witnessed in the recent past. This is a human crisis, but it also became a development and financing crisis. It's the first development emergency, I remember. And developing countries face vastly increased demands for public spending exactly at the same time as tax and export revenues, inward investments, and remittances are plummeting. As we craft a comprehensive global response, action and on finance must be central. If countries lack the financial means to fight the pandemic and invest in recovery, we face a health catastrophe and a painfully slow global recovery. We are on the cusp of a widespread debt crisis, with many countries faced with an impossible choice between servicing their debt or protecting their most vulnerable communities and fighting the pandemic. And debt defaults can have devastating social consequences. And many countries simply do not have access to financial markets to be able to service their debt. The G20 debt service suspension for the poorest countries was a welcome start, but much more needs to be done. Support must be expanded and determined by vulnerability rather than just GDP. We absolutely need to address the debt concerns of most of the developing countries and a large number of middle-income countries that have lost the capacity to access financial markets. And we also need to start thinking about durable solutions on debt that will create fiscal space for investments in recovery and the sustainable development goals. Beyond the fiscal shock, the COVID-19 crisis has impacted all the components of external finance: direct investment, exports, and remittances. Official development assistance is under pressure as developed countries themselves deal with the fallout of the crisis. Uncertainty and a further retreat to inward-looking policies and protectionism could turn today's sharp decline into a prolonged period of weak external financing. Moreover, as the pandemic disrupts supply chains and trade, there is a danger that some manufacturing will move back to developed countries, further reducing developing countries' resources and raising fundamental questions about their integration into the global economy. These questions need bold and creative answers. Some of the most prominent and innovative economists involved in reimagining our world today happen to be women. And it is also striking that while just 10% of global leaders are women, many of these leaders have launched decisive and effective responses to the pandemic. We need the insights and perspectives of all if we are to create the inclusive, resilient, and gender-equal societies we need to address the climate crisis and other global challenges. So I'm delighted to welcome this very distinguished panel of renowned economists and to listen to your ideas and your perspectives. Welcome and all the best for your discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary General. And I know that, of course, as the leader of the United Nations, you have a very busy agenda, but the Secretary General will be able to stay with us for some of our discussions, but will have to leave early. And I have to say, Secretary General, you are the only male at this round table. So that must be quite an unusual event for you. So there you go. Thank you very much indeed for introducing this discussion of, as you say, eminent women economists. Our co-convener is the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, herself a distinguished economist. This is her second stint in the role. She herself has been in the past a managing director of the World Bank Group, and like just about everybody else on this panel, has a PhD in economics. So it makes me feel, with my master's degree, rather pathetic. But anyway, thank you very much indeed, Finance Minister. Please do give us your opening remarks.
Good morning or good afternoon for everybody. Here is night for Secretary General. Thank you for convening this roundtable of eminent economists, women, to discuss about rebirthing the economy from the pandemic. As you all heard from the SG, that pandemic has changed significantly the way we live today. And in terms of the implication on social and economic, it's actually very significant. We saw the global economy has been entering to the recession, or even some has described it as potential depression. And for many economies, that means that they are going to lose what the progress being made in the past 2-3 decades, that is poverty reduction, or in this case, sharing prosperity. Indonesia, for example, we suffer a setback on poverty reduction by around 5 years because of this pandemic in the first 6 months. So for the SDG point of view, the pandemic is definitely attacking what we call it people, prosperity, and partnership together. And out of 5P of the SDG, definitely people, prosperity, and partnership. And how we are going to rebuild back, or in this case, rebirthing the economy, in which the people, prosperity, and partnership is going to be the 3 important pillars, not to mention, of course, planet, as mentioned by SG before. First, the pandemic is affecting the country's economy significantly. And that definitely make the resource of financing to achieve that development goal is going to be restrained. Revenue from the taxation drop because all the economic activity has been contracted. And at the same time, the need to spend both for the health as well as social safety net and stimulating back the economy increased dramatically. I gave my own country's experience. Originally, our budget this year was designed for 1.7% of GDP deficit, very small if you compare with many other countries in the world. But because of this COVID, we now immediately have to revise our budget with a deficit of up to 6.3%, significant increase. So all countries definitely are facing with the same situation. So the next question is how you are going to finance with such a large increase of deficit. Some countries, even their fiscal space and debt to GDP ratio is already beyond limit. For Indonesia, maybe we are lucky because we are having a much lower debt to GDP ratio, which is around 30%. But immediately within 1 year, the debt to GDP ratio will be potentially increased up to 37% of GDP, increased by 7% of GDP. So where the source of financing? So if the country have their own fiscal space, they can generate from their own, including their past saving. Or in this case, multilateral institution can become, especially for the low income, emerging country, developing country, their role is becoming very important. And in this case, I really want to express the appreciation, my appreciation to some of these multilateral who are responding very quickly by providing not only financing in a very quick disburse, but also focusing for supporting the countries to be able to address the issue on a health as well as social safety net. That is a very good, quick, fast disperse. It's a very, very welcome and appreciated. But it will not adequate. If you consider the need for the financing is going to be much larger than what multilateral institution can provide. So they have to come to the other lending, whether this is coming from their own local currencies market, bonds, or from the global. Unfortunately, even though at this moment, ironically, global financial situation characterized by very low interest rate, sometimes even zero. But for many low-income country and developing country, when they access to this global financing, they have to pay in such a very high price. And that is the discrimination that is not creating what you call it equal opportunity for many countries to be able to catch up or to address this pandemic related issue in a what you call it equitable way. So access and price is going to be very critical. So how we are going to discuss about this debt, which is many for developing country have to suffer from limited access as well as a very high price. And they are now facing with the growth which is below the interest rate that they have to pay. So the debt dynamic is going to be very difficult for many countries in the world. I think the first thing that we need to do for many countries is using this crisis to pressure or to pursue more ambitious reform, whether this is on education, health, social safety net, or quality of spending. Because, like in my own country, when you increase spending, the question is whether this spending justified, whether they are actually on the right direction, whether they are delivered and have the positive impact to the people and economy. That is all about quality of spending. Design of policy in such a very emergency situation is very difficult and challenging, but you really have to try your best. Of course, if you have a good health system, education system, they actually can have a much better opportunity to have a better quality of spending. Second, with this forcing us to go to the work from home, school from home, I think the role of the digital infrastructure is going to be very critical. You can substitute those activity into the virtual base, and we are forced by situation, and remarkably it's actually working. I've been in my house working from home for more than 4 months, and the Ministry of Finance is still performing well. We can actually design a good policy to respond to this emergency situation. We submit twice revision of the budget to the parliament. We still discuss with the parliament even virtually. So this is actually changed dramatically what we don't see and plan before. But what is important, whether a country have the infrastructure, digital infrastructure to change immediately into this virtual business process or business conduct. So investing in IT and digital infrastructure is going to be very critical from now and in the future. The last thing is, of course, whether the global financial architecture is actually responding well to this situation. I think at this very moment, many countries are facing mostly fiscal deficit, not yet balance of payment situation. But if it is not going to be addressed soon, then this fiscal situation will then affect the financial sector in the form of non-performing loan, then it can dangerously become an economic and financial crisis for many countries in the world. This kind of situation will require a very fast policy response. One of it may be relaxation. This is actually more like a pendulum. For 2008, we are restricting and putting more prudential policy on the banking system. Now we are actually relaxing in order for them to be able to restructure and allowing both the bank as well as the company to adjust because of this external shock. The question whether this pendulum of restructuring and relaxation of prudential regulation will not lead to the next crisis in the next decade. So this is all the area that demand and require quite a lot of important attention. I will close by saying that this pandemic mostly attacking what is non-traditional segment of the society. If we have a financial crisis, it was bank or big company which is usually devastated from those crises. This time, pandemic is attacking the grassroots people, informal sector, small medium enterprises, the poor, and especially women. And that's why in designing of rebirthing the economy, we really have to pay attention, especially for this poor, which is excluded from the benefit of many of government policy before, and especially from the gender point of view, the role of women. And for Indonesia, we are doing that. Many of our restructuring in the first phase of this pandemic really dedicated for all women, small, medium enterprises who receive government policy in the form of subsidy as well as restructuring of their debt so that they are allowed to survive during this very difficult situation. I do hope on all many other policy, whether in a health reform, education reform, we have to put this woman lens and especially the lens from the perspective of the gender that is allowing us to have a good and better policy and inclusive policy so that the one who really attacking by this pandemic is going to be the one who will get the benefit and rescue by the government policy. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for that very comprehensive overview of the challenges that lie ahead. And thank you for reminding us about the need to close the gender gap, one of the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, and SDG 17, about the need to work in partnership. Thank you very much indeed for your counsel. I'd now like to invite the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, for her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeinab. I'm really happy to join the SG in extending my warm greetings to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you around this table and an honor to take the floor after the Secretary General, our feminist in chief, and after our friend and leader, Minister Indrawati. We're here today to try to imagine a new global economy in which finance becomes a means and not an end. One that balances shareholders' interests with people and planet in all areas, but especially in trade, in debt vulnerability and external finance. When I came across a news article last month about a group of economists who are, and I quote, revolutionizing in their field, flipping priorities and challenging outdated models and measures, I knew I had to meet these women. Women that are challenging the status quo, lending credibility to women's leadership in shaping and transforming our world. As renowned economists and leaders, we are going to need your insights to understand trade flows and shape the value chains of the future in a more sustainable and fairer way. We will need your arguments to persuade private creditors and rating agencies to consider their fiduciary duties in a wider perspective, encompassing their societal effects. External finance is also going to be needed to change course. We need a partnership with financial markets to change the balance and to achieve the SDGs. Investments can not only be about profit at any cost, investments need to land on the right side of history. In rebirthing, we need to break the inequality and environmental degradation enchantment that darkens the horizon. The new global economy must be based on sustainable consumption and production, on sustainable infrastructure, one that gives access to all the opportunities of the future. And the transformation cannot stop there. We need to transform our institutions, both public and private, to ensure that democracy and markets are accountable to people, to key stakeholders. We need to co-create and expand partnerships now to ensure a green and more inclusive and fairer response for our recovery. It's not going to be easy. We're living in times of deep geopolitical, technological, and intergenerational shifts. For the first time in a century, there is no model that responds to this unprecedented crisis. Globalization and liberal markets have failed us on many fronts, and we don't have an alternative paradigm. We need to co-create one that is based on putting people and the planet at the center of the work that we do. And we need to do it now for the next generation. Pandemics, acute inequality, climate change, demographic shifts, shrinking civil space loss of privacy, big cities, and rapid technological change are all on the horizon of our young people. They don't see themselves in the traditional jobs. They struggle to see themselves in a digitalized and robotized economy, and they don't see themselves at all. And this is the tragedy. Rebirthing the global economy is an opportunity to empower them, to shape the current and looming challenges with solutions that will make a difference in their lives. We count on you today, leaders of this roundtable, to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Amina Mohammed. So no pressure to the women economists there. The Deputy Secretary General has thrown the gauntlet down, and the challenge is for you to come up with some new and innovative ways of attacking the common problems that we have. Now, I would like to introduce a couple of video recorded messages from Kristalina Georgieva first, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, who could not be with us, but would like to send this message of support. So if we could hear that now, please.
Greetings from the IMF. I'm very grateful to the Secretary General for inviting me at the launch of this roundtable of women economists. A crisis like no other requires a response like no other. And that means tapping into your talent to give answers to the tough questions we are wrestling with. How to make sure that we can return to strong growth and create jobs for the millions of people who need it. How to invest in growth that is low carbon, climate resilient, and most importantly, how to make our societies more inclusive, more equitable, how to build on this crisis as an opportunity for a better future. Look forward to the answers you will provide.
Kristalina Georgieva there reminding us, of course, about the importance of finding jobs where there already has been all over the world, of course, unemployment, and there's a great deal of pressure on jobs as it is now, and how important decent employment is for economic growth. I'd now like to play this video message of support from Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank. Thank you. Thank you.
Dear Amina, dear Shrimulyani, dear sisters and lady friends, I'm really sorry not to be with you, but at Antonio's request, and because I really meant to be with you, I'm doing this recording, which is, nothing like seeing you and sharing views and looking into your eyes and having a lot of affection expressed through eyes. But I'm happy to be with you. First of all, I'd like to thank Antonio for taking this initiative. And as I said to Amina, I look forward to participating in subsequent events. Let me just take a few minutes, not long, just to give you my sense and my take of where we are at the moment and why your commitment, our commitment, is so important. I said recently in one of those forever webinars, which I begin to dislike enormously, that the worst is behind us and the hardest is yet to come. And let me explain what I mean by that. You will probably discuss numbers and forecasts and all the rest of it. And I think it's a fact that the worst in terms of macro is behind us. And yet the hardest is yet to come, because what is coming is as many asymmetric effects as we had a symmetric shock. It's a recovery that is going to be as uncertain and as uneven as the shock was decisive and across the board. It's going to be people as impatient in this recovery process as they showed patience during the lockdown period. Is going to result in a rise of debt, both public and corporate, private in general, a rise of inequalities, a rise of unemployment. It's going to leave the most vulnerable of the people and of the countries in very, very difficult conditions. And I know that many of you are working hard on trying to alleviate the burden that they will be suffering. And I think it is going to require all hands on deck, all policies and all tools in order to address this moment that is so critical. A moment that can be as bleak as it can be transformational. A moment that I would characterize as the revenge of, I'd say, proximity over mobility, the revenge of digital over physical, and certainly a time when if we don't put green and sustainable development ahead of everything else, and solidarity as a key principle, we might be up for some strange, very unpleasant awakening. And I think that that's, when the going gets tough, that the girls should get going. Many of you are economists, all of you are women, and I think it's a time when it's about rational intelligence, but it's about emotional intelligence as well. And for the many last decades I've experienced in my professional life, I think that we are better at both and combining the two. So for those of you who look at models, I know that you look more than others into the models. And for those who work on models, I know that you work beyond them. And I would strongly encourage all of us to continue doing so and to applying both our rational and our emotional intelligence in order to address the challenges ahead. Because yes, I think that the worst is behind us and that the hardest is yet to come. I trust you, my sisters and lady friends, to look at all these issues and more, and to outsmart each and every one of us, although each and every one of us know that it's not about us, it's about those that we serve. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing many of you and talking to many of you soon. Bye. Bye.
Well, thank you to Christine Lagarde there for her warm words of sisterly solidarity and for restating her real passion and belief in what she called girl power to transform the world. So we're going to be listening to our women economists. First of all, we're going to be looking at external finance. Before we do that, we're going to set the scene with this brief video looking at the challenges within that particular area. The coronavirus crisis has created a perfect storm. Governments are confronted with the triple challenge of fiscal deficits, shortfalls in government incomes, and debt accumulation. And trying to find external sources of finance has become very difficult. Let us list some of the main reasons why. Many nations are experiencing capital flight. In March alone this year, outflows of capital and financial assets from emerging economies amounted to nearly $84 billion. This has reduced pools of domestic finance for borrowing, as well as dented confidence in home markets. Foreign direct investment is projected to decline between 30 to 40%. Remittances are expected to drop 20%, as jobs and work opportunities are lost because of shrinking economies. Governments in richer countries are not managing to ring-fence amounts for official development assistance, and this continues to fall below the goal of 0.7% of gross national income. However, There are lessons to be learned from the pandemic, and these should be reflected in how systems should be built back in ways that are more resilient and shock-proof. Most importantly, money should be spent carefully to ensure it has the greatest impact on improving the lives of people who are falling the furthest behind, so we can build back better for a more sustainable, equal, and inclusive future. So there we are. When I'm now going to invite all our women economists to make their opening comments, but really it's a discussion. We don't have prepared speeches as such, except that I will ask the odd person to make some opening remarks. And in this particular section, looking at external finance, we'll talk about debt and international trade a little bit later. I'd like to ask Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who holds the chair in Economics of Innovation and Public Value at the University College London here. And Mariana, you also are a special advisor for the European Commission on Research, Science and Innovation. So just give us some opening thoughts. You are renowned for rethinking the role of public policy in shaping both the rate of growth and its direction. So within the context of external finance, what can we do? Where's the money going to come from?
Sure. So I think first it's important to recognize that actually there's never really been a lack of finance. It's what finance has been doing and where it's been going. And so that whole question of the direction of finance, I think, is key. In the financial crisis, there was huge amounts, trillions were poured into the system. Most of that actually ended up back in the financial system itself. And this is true in many countries, like where I'm sitting today in the UK. Only £1 out of every 10 that the private banking system puts into the system actually even goes to the real economy. The rest goes to finance, insurance, and real estate. And so really the question is, how can we also make sure that central banks themselves start focusing just as much on the allocation of credit rather than this need just for more liquidity? And the other point is really, again, lots of finance, but the type of finance is often problematic. In both developing and developed countries, there's plenty of impatient finance, what you actually need to really spur development, but also innovation and investment-led growth is more patient, long-term, committed finance. And that's the kind of finance that actually often does come from different types of development banking institutions. But there too, I would say, kind of a third problem is sometimes with those institutions, we've sort of lost the opportunity to create stronger conditionality. And so, if we want to take the Sustainable Development Goals seriously, kind of walk the talk about those really ambitious goals, the 169 targets beneath them, we really need much more conditionality in the way that governments and different transnational financial institutions provide that finance. And so I think what's really curious right now with COVID is that we're waking up to this in some countries. In Denmark, by the way, they've refused to give bailouts to companies that use tax havens. In France, the bailout that was provided to both Renault and Air France was based on commitments towards lower carbon emissions of those sectors. And in the US, you might know that another fantastic woman, Elizabeth Warren, has been talking about conditionalities on value extraction, kind of lowering the amount of profits that are being used simply for things like share buybacks as a condition for, again, the funds that are coming from government. So that really requires also aligning the way we think about finance and the role of finance with really industrial strategy. And it's also quite useful that industrial strategy is back after decades of being almost a blasphemy, but it's not enough to think about industrial strategy as like picking sectors or types of firms. It really should be about industrial transformation and, across all sectors. And this role that public financial institutions can play in creating conditions for industrial transformation, even in old sectors like steel, is key. And just one quick example of how that happened in some recent years in Germany, instead of a public bank just kind of handing out money to the steel sector, and steel is a sector that does tend to ask for money, there was conditions attached in Germany for steel to reduce its material content to repurpose, reuse, and recycle. The way they did it was up to them, so that can spur innovation. But that conditionality is really what we need to properly get what people call stakeholder capitalism, stakeholder governance. And today, the German steel industry is innovative, not because it woke up one day and said, we need to be more stakeholder driven, but there was conditions attached to the finance they received. I could go on, but let's stick to our 3 minutes.
That's really good. Thank you very much for giving us that. So let's go to Dr. Leila Fourie, who was appointed CEO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange just in October. Still feeling your way, no doubt, Leila. And I know that you've had extensive experience working in local and multinational companies. So we heard Mariana there talk about, purpose-driven, sometimes it's called purpose-driven capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, really pressing the reset button on capitalism, getting committed finance. How committed do you think that the world of business and industry is to this kind of thinking? Is there a mood for change?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning and afternoon and evening to all the delegates and Mr. Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General and the Minister. Well, I suppose as a South African, I speak to you from the country with probably one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world, and also from a continent which will be one of the most hardest hit by climate change. And that obviously has catastrophic consequences for the youngest population in the world. And this will obviously in turn have international ramifications, as the people of Africa would be forced to become climate refugees, might be displaced by wars over food, water, and shelter. And so we are definitely facing very much of an existential crisis in the emerging markets. And I'd like to just elaborate on some of the points that were made by Marianne around the fact that we don't have a crisis of availability of funds, but it's really about how those funds are allocated. And so we absolutely need to understand that the concept of sustainable development and its link to international finance is an integral component of the economic recovery, and that will determine the sustainability and even indeed the future of emerging markets. And I would like to advance an argument which highlights the complexity that is faced by emerging markets, and that's really on 3 levels. All of these constrain the emerging markets' ability to address the SDGs, and they also highlight the dire need for emerging markets for international finance. The first is debt, the cost of debt servicing. The second is the exchange rate volatility that emerging markets are experiencing, and that will culminate in the third, which is a compounding effect of growth challenges in emerging markets. So we need to look backwards to look forwards, and we need to consider that the COVID crisis is existing on top of an already culminated and evolving economic environment as a result of the GFC. And so when governments after the GFC embarked on unprecedented monetary and fiscal stimulus to avoid what they saw at the time as a looming recession, it led to a stepwise increase in public debt to GDP ratios. And when those interest rates started to approach zero, governments, particularly developed world governments, embarked on quantitative easing in the hope that financial institutions would distribute that liquidity to get the economy going. This did help to some extent, and we've since witnessed a bull market. And we've seen that money translated into a dislocation from the real economy. The S&P quintupled over the last decade. And so the distribution of this liquidity was uneven, and the resultant recovery eluded many of the problems that were faced by the man on the street, and he's seen very little change in the struggles that he's experiencing, and particularly in emerging markets. So as interest rates remain low and advancing economies have suppressed the increase in debt service costs as a result of low interest rates, advanced economies were net beneficiaries on a relative basis. Emerging markets have not been fortunate for a number of reasons. Emerging markets had low debt, than developed markets, and the interest was also higher. And so they weren't insulated. In addition to this sustained high level of interest rates and therefore a higher level of costs.
Yeah, Leila? Yes.
Yes.
Just sorry, yes, I mean, it's fine. Just remember not to give prepared remarks. It really is just getting your view. Sorry, do you come
Yes.
to your point?
So I think I could just come to the conclusion, and the conclusion really is that emerging markets relative to developed worlds have experienced significantly high debt servicing costs.
Sure.
They are facing much higher exchange rates, and that is culminating in low growth. So the question that we need to answer is, how can we create sustained growth and address this inequality that is occurring between emerging market countries and developed world? World growth is not world growth if emerging market economies are left behind.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Leila. And sorry to cut you short, but ladies, I would like to come through to everybody on this particular topic and looking at the broad picture here. Antoinette Sayer, you're Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and you've also been a Minister of Finance in Liberia at that very critical time in 2006 through 2008 when Liberia was emerging from its conflict. So just on this issue of looking at what this crisis means for the emerging economies, I think we know what the picture is, but what are your ideas for emerging economies to emerge out of this crisis?
Well, thank you very much, Zeinab. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. A pleasure to join this distinguished panel. And to begin by saying, I very much see the point, of course, of the issue of where money is allocated to. It's not enough to have availability of financing, but it very much matters where financing goes. Having said that, it is absolutely the case that the poorest countries at this point in time, given the multiple shocks that they've faced and are facing as a result of the pandemic, contracted global demand, trade, declined commodity prices, implosion of tourism, declining remittances, all those multiple shocks have undermined their ability to have financing of their own, and certainly underscores the need for increased external financing for those countries. So it is very important that they have more financing, and that is the focus we've had at the fund to very quickly make sure that we're providing that financing with no conditionality, disbursed 25 billion already to 72 countries, really wanting to make sure they have the resources to address the health crisis and to really sustain livelihoods as much as possible to weather these multiple shocks. But of course, we want them to spend it well. And that has been a huge focus as well. Countries committing to make sure that appropriate auditing and reporting is done to make sure that those resources actually go to the neediest in their countries and go to mitigating the impact of the crisis. So absolutely necessary to have both. And as we look to help countries emerge from the crisis ultimately, and it is going to take time to repair economies. Our most recent growth projections, of course, for 2020 and 2021 shows that the repair will be long in coming and very difficult. And so that financing has to continue for these countries, both in debt relief, as the fund itself has provided to its poorest countries, but also debt relief under the G20 initiative that is proceeding, needs to continue. We hope to be able to make a case that needs to continue beyond 2020 as well. And that the private creditors absolutely have to contribute to that. So countries absolutely need more financing. We need to take the opportunity, as you've been saying, Zeinab, in your introductory pieces, to really position all of us to contribute to building back better. And that is absolutely the focus we expect to have in this second wave of financing. We're positioning the fund to help with countries with the recovery. After this first phase of emergency financing, many countries we expect to need more fund financing, and we're absolutely preparing to provide that.
Thank you very much indeed, Antoinette. And of course, we know that the IMF has actually said that there's been a 16-fold increase in annual average disbursements to 16 billion this year. And Kristalina Georgieva only today has said specifically about Africa, without tens of billions of dollars of additional support, and I quote her, she says there can be very significant scarring with long-term consequences for Africa. But this issue of conditionality seems to be a theme that's emerging very much indeed. So let me come to you, Professor Naila Kabir, a professor at the Departments of International Development and Gender Studies at the London School of Economics, based here in London. And Naila, I know you describe yourself as a feminist economist. So just give us some brief introductory remarks on what do you think about this issue of conditionality? We've heard about how bailouts in France by the French government to Air France have been linked to green goals, you know, specific targets on carbon reduction and so on. Do you think this is something that should be done across the board, linking bailouts, money in whatever form it's given, to sustainable and inclusive growth? And how workable do you think that is?
Not sure how workable it is, but I certainly think it should be the case. I think the idea of large sums of money going to people who have no accountability towards the larger society is something that should be left behind. I was very troubled that in the UK, today, we've just announced a stimulus package, which seems to be about build, build, build. And we're talking about building physical infrastructure. And what has been lost in that focus on the kind of fallback of going back to physical infrastructure is something that feminist economists have been harping on about. And that is that the labor intensity, employment intensity, and the multiplier effects of investing in social infrastructure. And that means the kind of, you know, when the Secretary General report talks about this crisis having hit at the fundamental human capabilities of people, it's that we need to build up for the future, not just to get out of this crisis, but to be resilient in the future. And so I would like to see, I'm not sure if we do it through conditionality, but I would like to see far more emphasis on building jobs that contribute to health, to education, to care, to skills. Because it is that infrastructure, I think, that economies need if they are to face crises in the future. So my argument would be we don't abandon the idea of stimulus through physical infrastructure, but we look far more widely at a grassroots economy and what are the key assets that people bring to their livelihood, and that is their human capabilities. So, you know, my very simple message is, can we not just always go back to old solutions? Can we think about the future by investing in people's skills and people's health and so on?
Thank you very much indeed for that, Naila. And I'm going to stay with the LSE and go to Minouche Shafik, who of course is a leading economist and is director of the LSE, but previously she's been the youngest ever vice president of the World Bank and also taught at various academic universities in the United States, and was permanent secretary of the Department for International Development here in the United Kingdom, also deputy MD of the IMF, and also deputy governor at the Bank of England. So many things you've done, Minouche. I can't go through all of them, but just give us a brief overview on this issue and the topics that are being raised on external finance, remembering that we're going to be talking about debt and international trade later. Minouche, can you hear me? Minouche may not be with us just yet. So let me try Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Vera, are you with me? Are you with us?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Oh, yes. Good. Okay, so Vera, obviously, you've done a lot of work on these kind of issues, but just keep your comments about debt and international trade for a little bit later, because I'll be coming to you on that. But just a kind of, you know, a response to what you've heard some of your fellow economists saying about, resetting capitalism, stakeholder purpose-driven capitalism, conditionality of giving money in whatever forms it is, and the availability of funding for people who are working in the real economy. Just some opening thoughts.
No, I think, thank you very much. I want to second a little bit, of course, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. It's raining cats and dogs here, so I don't know, hopefully you can hear me. Finally, I can connect, but it feels like midnight. It's actually quite dark at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. No, I think two things. Maybe that is why the women should do this. The first one, and I want to go back to the point that maybe Leila made and also Shrimuliani, it's about the way we even see the direction of travel of the resources. And I think Mariana also mentioned that a little bit, is where are the resources going? When we talk about finance, insurance, and real estate, they're not moving. They essentially, it's the same paper. And, most of us, Christine said something about running models. We can run models where we create trillions of dollars and they never make it into anybody's economy, except a few people that take parachutes. And my sense is we need to start building on economies that build on creation of real value, as opposed to creation of paper value. And I don't think we've really done that in the last 10 years. We have become experts at creating, I would say, a fictitious value. And part of it is because we have undermined traditional conversations, and I'm going to talk a little bit about agriculture, because when we talk about debt, at the end of the day, debt is about not generating enough value in an asset to be able to sell it back. And this happens because the trade or the productive capacities of most of our developing countries have not risen to the standard they should rise to. And so my sense is we cannot just talk about the financing part without talking about what is the service that is being produced. And that brings us directly into the conversation on diversification of economies. As long as we cannot have that other discussion, I think the discussion just on financing, as somebody said, there is more than enough resources and financing out there. We can find it. We can create it if we want to. We can print it if we need to. But the issue is, what are we printing it for? And I think a conversation around the diversification of production of our economies becomes an important conversation that we must have. And so, yes, conditionality, but maybe conditionality now on what are we producing, as opposed to conditionality on, where we're using the resources. And I dare to say that I am becoming increasingly opposed to safety nets, because I believe that they have become a huge transfer to the developing world, but they don't produce anything. They don't make us become more productive. And essentially, they just keep us poor. So I am saying something, this is amongst us, but I just want to push us to say, all that safety net transfer, what is it producing for Africa, for God's sakes? I would rather give us energy so that we can actually be innovative. And so I love this financing conversation, but if the financing conversation is to keep us poor and just ensure that we live at $1.20 a day, it's the wrong conversation. I stop there.
You've thrown the
because I wasn't supposed to talk around debt. But, we can't pay our debt if you're giving us money for safety net. For us to pay our debt, you have to give us money for productive stuff. So
right. Good. Well, we'll come back to you later on that, on debt particularly, and this new idea you have for financing as well, Vera. But interesting what you say about safety nets is not the way to go forward. Let me go to Professor Stephanie Kelton from Stony Brook University, who's written a book on modern monetary theory, a new approach to economics, and it's been taking the world by storm, Stephanie, in your most recent book, which is out just now, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy, is already on its way to becoming a bestseller. And you very much challenge existing thinking on economic policy. So just picking up on what Vera Songwe says, do you go along with that?
I do. I loved those remarks, in fact. I think that, this idea that somehow we're doing all we can to assist developing countries by providing them a vehicle, primarily through exports, through which they can earn a foreign currency, very often the US dollar, which they then turn around and hand over to creditors in service of perpetual debt. And I think that was her point. So that we are not doing, I think, what we ought to be doing to help developing countries actually get out of the developing country status. And so what would some of those things look like? I think the US can play a very important role here, and must, in fact, as a leader. We can act as a global leader in terms of the way that we participate in creating and reforming trade arrangements. We can help set standards in deals that we help craft. Like, we can demand stricter ecological standards. We can ensure that there are robust labor protections. We can share with developing countries green technologies and intellectual property. We can help poor nations develop food and energy security so that they aren't dependent upon the rest of the world for critical imports of medicines, technologies, food, and energy. And I think that providing financing is part of what needs to be done, but there are also non-financial commitments that the developed world can, and I think needs to make to the rest of the world. I could go on for quite a bit longer. I know you have a lot of other voices, important voices that we need to hear from, but for just a few ideas.
Your voice is very important. Thank you very much indeed. And you're emphasizing there the role that countries like the United States obviously can play in setting these standards for universal standards. So thank you for that, Stephanie. Come back to you later. Let's go to Caroline Freyund, who's Global Director of Trade, Investment and Competitiveness at the World Bank. And previously, you've also worked as a chief economist at the World Bank for the Middle East and North Africa. But Caroline, I will come to you about trade later on when we come to that particular section, but just some opening remarks on what you've heard so far, just to kind of clear your throat, as it were.
Thank you very much. And a lot of what I've heard resonates. So one thing we've seen at the World Bank is, and as was said from our IMF colleagues as well, is this is really a crisis like no other. So we're predicting GDP decline globally of more than 5%. And the really distinguishing feature is that more countries are going into recession or in recession at any time since 1870. So it's not only a deep recession, but it's extremely broad-based. So that's one point I wanted to raise. And we're contributing to it, of course, with external financing, projecting 160 billion over the next 15 months. But compared to the amount of money going in advanced countries, the trillions of dollars, this is really a drop in the bucket. So we'll need a lot more than that. In terms of how we're spending that money, it started with relief for healthcare and for people, went on to restructuring, especially keeping firms in business. Because if you lose the small and medium-sized enterprises, especially during this crisis, then you'll be left only with large and SOEs, and a lot of jobs will be lost, permanent economic scarring, and so forth. And then finally thinking about recovery. And I think really the critical thing is the reforms that have been said earlier, that we do need reforms to have a strong recovery around trade, around investment, around the business climate. And there are still many countries that can stimulate growth through serious reforms. And even one senior government official I talked about a beauty pageant of reform, where countries are competing because there's so little foreign investment out there, or where there's reshaping GBCs, they want to attract those. So hopefully we'll see some of that. And finally, something that hasn't been raised that I'd also like to put on the table is the danger we have right now of limited global cooperation that wasn't as prominent around the global financial crisis. And in terms of resources, it's really critical because we haven't been able to raise taxes from corporations as capital has become so mobile. And addressing that challenge for countries to be able to raise resources will require cooperation on the tax agenda. Of course, we need cooperation on many other agendas, including trade as well. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
And reminding us, thank you very much indeed, Caroline, and reminding us about the cooperation on tax that's needed. And there are lots of discussions I know going on about that kind of thing at the moment. Let's go to Bogolo Kenewendo, who is an economist and was a former Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry in Botswana and is now running her own consultancy. And Bogolo, I also know you are a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. So I wonder perhaps if you could also talk about the challenges and how we can refashion the world, bringing in, of course, the role of technology in terms of good and bad impacts on jobs and also in transforming and reshaping the post-COVID-19 world.
Thank you very much, and a very good day to everyone. It's really interesting that last year when we were working on the report for digital cooperation, there were a few countries, particularly in Africa, that wanted to engage in the conversation of digitalization. And COVID, fortunately or unfortunately, as some people see it, has forced people, put them in a corner to start thinking about the new world and the new normal, which really relies on, or it calls for all of us to drive digitalization and to recognize it as a more efficient way of delivering services and of transforming our economies. And in that particular report, we talk about the item number 1 is just about an inclusive digital economy. And I think this is particularly important now as we're talking about external financing, that we start to recognize, or multilateral financing institutions recognize that the budget that currently exists for ICT infrastructure is too low. And the budget that exists for ICT policy making is also too low. It's about 4% and 1% each, and we need to reform that as we're thinking about building back stronger, because stronger will need for us certainly to have digital infrastructure in place. But while we're also talking about financing, I want us to also think about domestic financing, providing capacity for countries to tap and harness domestic financing, because some of it, there's a lot of liquidity in countries like Botswana and countries like Ghana. And later on, we start to see capital flight because governments are not harnessing on this domestic capital. And I think the problem is also just around capacity. How do you do it structurally in a way that makes sense and will help to develop the economies locally? And because of this capital flight, because of the decline in FDI, we are going to see a regress in our SME development and in the protection of resiliency of our informal sector. And these are very key to us progressing in SDGs. I'll just stop there because I know I'm talking about trade a little later.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Bogolo. I'd like to go to Kate Rayworth now, who's a British economist and is Senior Research Associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute. And Kate, you became very famous when you talked about donut economics. And forgive me, I'll just very quickly remind everybody, it's a kind of visual framework for sustainable development. Hope I get this right, that the whole kind of represents people who lack basic needs, and then the crust kind of represents the planetary economic boundaries. I mean, that in a kind of nutshell is it. But just give us some brief opening remarks, please, because I'm very mindful of time. We've still got to talk about debt and trade, and we've still got some more comments coming from some other speakers. So just please give us your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Zeinab, and it's an honor to join this conversation with fantastic thinkers. Yes, the donut. This is the goal of the 21st century. Leave nobody falling short on the essentials of life without food, water, communications, power, healthcare, education, and don't overshoot the life-supporting systems of our planet. It's incredibly simple. And the reason I'm holding this up is because it tells us that 21st century thriving is about balance. And yet we're talking about finance, and we've inherited a financial system from the 20th century. in fact, from the 15th century. We have a financial system that is predicated on the idea that finance will reap a financial return, which will reap another financial return. So finance expects to accumulate endlessly, and yet humanity and planetary health lies in balance. And I want to say very simply, I think there's a fundamental contradiction in there. We cannot redesign the climatic and earth system. It will be redesigned by us destroying it. We can, however, redesign finance because it's an entirely a human construct. And if there's one thing I think we should rebirth, is rebirth what we think finance is in service to. As so many people here have said, it's currently in service to itself, and it must be put in service to humanity and a thriving planet.
Was nice and succinct, and we enjoyed looking at your donut. Thank you very much. So let's now look at debt, which has been mentioned in various forms. And before we have a quick discussion on debt, we've heard from everybody except Minouche Shafiq, but I will come back to you, Minouche, straight away when we come to debt. Let's just have this brief overview of the problem. When it comes to global debt, the pandemic has made a bad situation worse. As governments try to recover from the devastating consequences of lockdowns, they've unleashed enormous stimulus packages, spending trillions of dollars. But this will pile on even more debt, and many countries will emerge with much higher budget deficits and debt. Nations around the world were already under strain before the COVID-19 crisis. Nearly 40 middle-income countries were rated below investment grade. Now, as the world economy is facing a contraction of up to 6%, even the richest nations are not being spared, and some could lose their AAA credit ratings. But it's lower income countries that are worse affected. Sharp declines in commodity prices, trade and tourism are drying up government resources. Investors have pulled back from risky assets and pushed up the cost of borrowing in financial markets. Debt servicing costs have more than doubled for low-income countries in the last 20 years and now account for 13% of government revenue. This means that some heavily indebted nations pay more on servicing their debt than on health. Earlier this year, the G20 group, who collectively account for 80% of global GDP, announced a debt standstill for 76 low-income countries. This frees up $20 billion for them to spend on citizens as well as on shoring up their economies. But this will not be enough. Even after the disease is brought under control, we know that coronavirus will leave a long-lasting legacy of debt, and so urgent new thinking and action is needed on debt management and relief for low and middle-income countries. So there we go. Let's go to Minouche Shafiq, Director of the London School of Economics. So Minouche, everybody says you can't afford to write off the debt. So how do we restructure it? Debt write-off, grants, concessionary funding. Your views, please, Minouche.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zeinab. Wonderful to be here with all these impressive women. And my apologies for being a little bit late. I was chairing an event in India in this crazy Zoom world that we all live in these days. I thought that video clip was very apt. The advanced economies have been able to break all the economic rules in terms of debt accumulation to deal with this crisis. Most advanced economies have taken fiscal measures that are going to grow their debts by 10 to 20% of GDP. So really unprecedented volumes of spending, whereas most developing countries have not had the capacity to respond at that scale, nowhere near that scale. And that's why, as you said in the clip, Zeinab, that debt servicing moratorium, debt relief, additional IMF resources in terms of an additional SDR allocation, those are the quickest ways to get money into the hands of finance ministers in poor countries to be able to do something in response to the crisis. I couldn't resist but responding to Vera's points about cash transfers and safety nets. Because I actually do believe that cash transfers are part of the solution in the short term. There have been, I don't know, I've read over 80 randomized controlled trials assessing the impact of cash transfer schemes all over the world. And the vast majority show clearly that cash transfer schemes, whether they're conditional or unconditional, do a huge amount to increase nutrition in the household, keep girls in schools, maintain household welfare beyond a certain threshold. So I guess I do believe in cash transfer schemes as part of the solution. Having said that, some of my colleagues at the LSE, Oriana Bandera and Robin Burgess, did some very interesting work over 7 years in Bangladesh on a program that BRAC did called the Asset Transfer Scheme. And what they did is rather than just do cash, they gave women assets, often a cow or a piece of something that would generate future income. 7 years later, those women who were in the lowest part of the income distribution had become middle class and had stayed middle class. And that was a randomized controlled trial of 7 years, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that asset transfer is part of the solution, but I do think in the short term, cash is what it's about. And then the only other thing I wanted to say about debt is the obvious question is how are countries going to pay this back? Even if they get some debt relief, they will spend more. And the question is always how do you pay it back? And historically, there are three ways that countries repay back debt. One is austerity, two is growth, and three is some kind of financial repression whereby you inflate the debt away. In practice, most countries do a little bit of a mix of all three of those things when you look at historical episodes of debt accumulation. Clearly, growth is the best way to do it. And for many developing countries, that is a serious prospect. I was at the IMF with Antoinette. We used to do endless debt sustainability analysis to see whether countries could sustain the debt levels that they had acquired. At a 0.5 percentage point of GDP was transformative in a debt sustainability analysis. Increasing growth by a little bit makes levels of debt far more sustainable for countries. And so I do think that using the debt that's accumulated now to invest in productive capacity that enables you to grow out of the debt is the key.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Minouche. One very, very concrete proposal. I'm going to go to Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie, we heard Minouche there talk about the fact that richer countries have taken massive unorthodox measures, when we're talking within this context of debt. But I just repeat what Ken Ofori-Atta, the finance minister of Ghana, has said. Whilst the richer countries are doing that, African countries are expected to play by the rules. So do we need a rewriting of the debt rules?
I think that transfers are better than loans. And I think that this trapping developing countries on a treadmill of perpetual debt and debt service, we have the results. We've got decades upon decades of results. We end up with countries that are never permitted to fully develop. And so I think it's important to recognize a couple of things. One is that there are some developing countries that have more fiscal capacity than others. The more dependent you are, I mentioned this a little while ago, the more dependent you are on the rest of the world for critical imports, energy, food, medicines, technology, the more likely it is that you are going to end up in one of these treadmill situations where you're forced to borrow in foreign currency, and then you have difficulties as interest rates rise. It becomes more and more difficult to service those debts. Then you end up at the IMF. Then you end up with more debt over time and struggling to either grow your way out of it or take one of these alternative measures, inflating the debt away and so forth. And so what I think is so critically important is that we recognize that, Madame Lagarde said, this is an all hands on deck situation. And we are fighting a common enemy right now. It's not like World War II when we fought one another. We are fighting a common enemy. And yet we need something, I think, akin to a Marshall Plan. We need the stronger countries, the developed world, to step forward and to provide the aid and assistance and help these other countries along. Because, I don't want to end up in a situation where we've got a divided world and we've got developed and developing countries, and the developing countries look the same as they did 10 and 20 and 30 and 50 years ago as we move, forward in time. I don't want to look back in 30 years and see the same group of developing countries still in a developing country status. So, I think I'll stop with that. I think aid is critically important, and I think we should start to shift away from this model where we continue lending as the primary means of trying to provide aid and assistance. There are real ways that we can help countries rather than constantly thinking in financial terms. We've got to do it with real resources.
All right, thanks very much indeed. Let's go to Mariana. Mariana, your views on debt briefly?
Sure. I mean, one thing which I think we all know, but it's just good to say that even though we talk about public debt, the real problem right now is private debt. That's what actually caused the financial crisis. And in many countries like the UK, it's private debt to disposable income is actually back at record levels, literally to the extent that it was just before the crisis. And unfortunately, with some of the COVID relief, because it hasn't actually been about debt relief, but just delaying, mortgage payments, for example, that's actually just going to make this problem even worse. Furthermore, because real wages have not been rising, many people have actually been taking out increasing amounts of debt just to retain their existing living standards. So until both those questions of real wages are taken on board, that's not going to be solved. But also in a country like where I'm from, Italy, again, people talk about public debt, but the actual deficit in Italy has actually been relatively modest. Debt to GDP has been rising. Why? Because the denominator has not been rising. Why? Because they haven't actually been spending and investing in all the strategic areas like human capital formation, education, research and development, which are long-run drivers of growth. So instead of having conditionality attached to lowering deficits, which unfortunately in Europe we've had and still have, there should actually be conditionality on investing and all those drivers of long-run growth. And that would completely change the conversation.
Kate, let's go to you, Kate Rayworth, because I know you've got some interesting thoughts on this question of debt.
When we talk about debt, we talk about financial debt, and then it's about internationally, we see it as poor countries owing it to rich countries. I want to talk about a different kind of debt, which is equally important and actually longer term. It's ecological debt, because I don't think there are any advanced countries or developed countries in the world. I'm sitting in the UK and all of Western Europe, all of the US, Canada, Japan. All of these countries are living way, way, way beyond planetary impacts. We are destroying the climate system. We are destroying the ecological system. And that is a debt we owe to the lowest income countries in the world, because we are undermining all prospects of development for them. They will have no fertile soils, no monsoon rains, no stable climate. They will have no capacity to develop and develop people's capacities in this situation. So I want to bring that into the story, because it's a huge power imbalance. We have financial debt, and it's high-income countries through, I would say, colonial-era institutions with voting power still dominated by the US in the World Bank, deciding on whether or not that should be cancelled. Whereas when it comes to ecological debt, high-income countries get to decide through voluntary contributions that they want to make through the Paris Agreement, whether to cut it or not. In the 21st century, we need to decolonize development institutions and these, whether it's financial debt or ecological debt. We need a complete re-reckoning of balance between nations, because there's so many people from Vera to Bolongi to others have said, we will never see these lower income countries have the capacity to generate their own sources of wealth unless high income countries come back within planetary boundaries and transfer the resources to enable them to develop their own sources of wealth.
Thanks very much indeed. Broadening it so that we redefine what we mean by debt. Naila Kabir, does that touch a chord with you?
Certainly. Am I on? Yes. Yes, certainly. I think what Kate is saying is, bringing on a much more fundamental, a much more existential idea of debt, which we haven't really, we focus so much on the financial side that we haven't looked at the real changes that are going on. But if you don't mind, Zeinab, I'd like to go back a little to the conversation earlier between Minouche and Vera. And that is because I think one of the things that worries me about some of this conversation is a fear that we will, in the future, continue with the boundaries between social and economic. And I heard that to some extent when Vera talked about safety nets. I agree with her, and I think we need to have a bigger picture of social policy instead of safety nets. And when Minouche talked about asset transfers in Bangladesh, that exactly illustrates what I mean, because those asset transfers were accompanied by investments in people's human capabilities and skills. On their own, economic assets for the poor are not enough. So I think, I'd like us to constantly look at the relationship between the economic and the social. And that's why my focus was very much on what can social policy do about making this recovery far more sustainable.
Thank you very much indeed, Naila. And Vera Songwi's name has been mentioned a couple of times in terms of Minouche saying and others saying they do support the direct cash transfers to poorer families or more needy families, whether they're conditional or not. Vera, I will give you a chance to come back to that and also to talk about the new initiative. You've talked about the need to create a new sustainability and liquidity facility for Africa, which you say will cut borrowing costs for African governments. But let me, first of all, bring in this short video about trade, because Vera, you can also come in there and talk about the impact of the decline in global trade on the African continental free trade area. So hold your fire, Vera, and let's play this video on trade. Could the COVID-19 pandemic change global trade forever? Lockdowns inflicted heavy blows on economies around the world. Factories were closed and all but essential activities ground to a halt. Manufacturing output in major hubs of the world slumped. Demand for goods and services fell dramatically as people retreated into their homes. The slowdown in industries that rely on metals and minerals led to sharp declines in commodity prices, and there was a huge drop in the need for oil. The fall in global consumer demand saw smaller manufacturing countries face sharp declines in their exports like textiles. And the global trade in goods is expected to fall between 13% to 32% this year. Also, the closing of borders and reduced activity means the airline industry has suffered a huge downturn from which it may never recover, leading to massive job losses internationally. But could COVID-19 also make the world retreat from globalization? The pandemic has made many governments take a long, hard look at their economy's dependence on globalized supply chains. The initial panic following the breakout for medical equipment and protective clothing such as masks exposed many countries' reliance on global suppliers for essential items and goods. This has fed into pre-existing concerns about dependence on foreign suppliers and has triggered moves to a greater integration of supply chains. So, could coronavirus be a major disruptor of global trade and, by extension, lead to greater barriers and protectionism? So some big picture questions there, which I will ask. I hope I'll have time to go around all of you to give us a very, very brief remark. But first of all, let me go to you, Vera Songwe. We've heard a lot there, diversifying supply chains, domesticating them, international trade. Give us your perspective from Africa.
Maybe with two numbers. On June 11th, the company called Apple became a $1.5 trillion company. This is an important statistic. Apple uses as one of its main critical inputs coltan. 80% of coltan is produced in the DRC. The DRC today is one of those countries that is in a debt crisis and will not be able to honor its debt obligations in the future because they cannot afford to do so, because it sells coltan at $40 to $80. On the market, coltan goes for $400. And so my posit for trade and the new trade environment is that we do everything we can to take away every intermediary that exists between the original product and the end product. I give you another statistic. 3 weeks ago, I participated in an internet trade fair between women agriculture farmers in Rwanda and the China Electronic World Trade Platform. And in less than a minute, we were able to sell 1.5 tons of Rwandan coffee at $12 a pack instead of $8 because we had taken away the intermediary. So I've given you two numbers. One where we've taken away the intermediary and Rwandan women make $4 each out of their coffee. And in 10 minutes, we sold 30,000, which they were not able to do before the crisis. And this is the positive of the crisis. So 30,000 tons we had to do in 4 months of logistics and trying to find the middleman and do that. So I think one of the big things today as we review and revisit, and Ngozi is here, so shout out to WTO, I just say that and keep it on the side, but is to really look at how we reduce intermediation. Because as in the financial markets, intermediation in the world of trade, and particularly for Africa, has been painful. The CFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, is essentially meant to do that. We think that globalization and global trade is important. However, what we would like to do is create a longer supply chain and value addition on the continent before we exchange the good. What has essentially happened, and I go back to coltan, is that 40 cents, you take out the coltan of $40, you send it to China or to Malaysia or someplace else, it gets processed, it goes back. And so we never see any value of any of the commodities. So it's not so much that commodity prices have fallen, because as much as commodity prices fall, the price of an iPhone for anybody who goes to buy an iPhone has constantly been increasing. It's the same DRC coltan that gets into that phone. So I think we do need to understand what is happening and where is value getting lost. And that is the real big point about one, diversification and improving the supply chain. And that's what I think Africa is trying to do with the CFTA, is get a longer supply chain process on the continent. I take another example, and that is where I have a problem with the safety nets a little bit. Yeah. One of the things that came out of the crisis is that we could not I'm done. We could not produce gloves. We don't have plastic gloves on the continent. We import all our gloves. 54 countries closed their markets. Prices skyrocketed. So our debt goes up because we pay more to buy anything, including gloves. 60% of the rubber in the world is produced on the continent. Rather than give a safety net, create a gloves factory, let the women work there as the safety net process, but we create jobs, we bring in technology, we transfer capacity. So my sense is how we redefine that safety net into a productive process. And I think that's what Leila was saying out of London. So I'm done with that. That's my posit on trade, stop intermediation.
Thanks very much indeed. Caroline Freyun, Director of World Bank, can you, on trade, could you come in on that? Cut out the middle man, woman.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent point, and there are reasons to be positive about it because of new technology. So one thing that companies are doing is supply chain digitalization, and this will really help to cut out the middleman. think a problem here is monopoly power of the buyer. So in the case of Apple, you have a monopoly buyer who can negotiate with suppliers. They have 80% of the market, so they have to be able to negotiate that. The other thing these new technologies can generate is services trade, so a rise in services trade. But right now, we're very concerned about the fall in trade. We've seen about 20% in April, though there's some indication with shipping data that it's coming back in May. And I think the question is, will companies reshore or nearshore to advanced countries, which will make it that much more difficult for developing countries to get into trade? And just going back to the point Stephanie made about we don't want to see developing countries stagnating for decades. Please recall that the period from 1990 to 2008 was a period of convergence, where developing countries were growing faster than advanced countries. And it was particularly driven by those that were most integrating into the world economy. So trade really offers the path to development if we can re-energize it. And that's where cooperation comes in, getting rid of the intermediary, finding a way to negotiate with these multinationals, dealing with issues that have been mucking up the trade system like subsidies and SOEs, and then starting to think about the new economy, trade and services, digital and data, and how to manage those. But again, this will require cooperation.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. Bogolo Kenewendo, just putting on your hat as a former Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry from Botswana, just give us a brief perspective on this issue of trade and what ideas you have.
Thank you. I think it's interesting that last year we were concerned about the multilateral trading system facing challenges by the trade war between the US and China. And this year, we are seeing more protectionist policies being pushed by the response to COVID. And the number one challenge that I want to put out to countries there is that, we should avoid these protectionist policies, because these beggar thy neighbor policies will only deepen the crises and will elongate the crises if we're not careful. So just like was agreed in 2009, 2010 by members of the OECD, I think there should be an agreement right now that we will not push for more protectionist policies, not only for trade, but for investment that our companies trade. And at the multilateral space, we really need to preserve the WTO once again to Madame Ngozi, and ensure that there's some effective and meaningful reforms at the WTO to ensure that even the developing, particularly members of the developing country, feel the change and feel the wealth created by trade. And then on a second level, I want to talk about the micro trading space. Now, this is where our SMEs and our informal sectors play. It's very important that we talk about this, particularly in Africa, because the large number of our traders are women and they're doing small cross-border trading. And we need, while I agree with Vera, I still think some sort of cash transfers to the SMEs and the informal sector. It's very important in order to jumpstart the businesses, especially post this COVID lockdowns, to recapitalize those businesses, and so that they can benefit from what she was talking about earlier with the EWTP. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Bogolo. Okay, ladies, I'm just going to give you literally, each of you who haven't spoken on trade, 1 minute to either make a brief comment, something innovative, something new about trade, or just give us a final closing remark about a new way forward, charting new territory. So let me go to you, Stephanie Kelton, if you're there, please. Just a quick final comment from you.
Well, okay, so I think that, one thing to keep in mind is that exports are a real cost and imports are a real benefit. And so when Vera is talking about the export the exportation of rubber from the continent and saying now we don't have the ability, we can't get rubber gloves. Your exports are your real cost. And it isn't to say that trade is not beneficial and there cannot be gains and benefits to countries through trade, but you just have to be very careful. Are you orienting your economy around production for the sake of export, for the sake of earning a currency that you need in order primarily to service debt? And so when we're talking about, safety nets and transfers, I think that what Vera is getting at here is that the safety net is really for the creditors. That's what the safety net is for. The safety net is there to ensure that the dollars continue to flow so that they can be recycled and returned to the hands of the creditors. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much indeed, Stephanie. Mariana Mazzucato, your brief closing remarks. 1 minute starts now.
I think one of the issues is how do we govern trade? And so, the most obvious misgovernance of this is around healthcare and healthcare products. So how intellectual property rights are abused. Vaccines right now, yes, there's a race for the COVID vaccine, but unless we make sure, as the WHO is arguing, that we need a common patent pool, then actually we're going to see the same kind of rent seeking, which Vera was talking about. And by the way, just this week, we've learned that Gilead is going to be charging $3,120 for its COVID drug, remdesivir. And that drug was actually developed largely by the US taxpayer. So 70 million US dollars went to that. And the fact that even though we all talk about public investment, if we can't then govern that investment to actually achieve inclusive and sustainable growth, it's a massive failure. And lastly, don't forget that Adam Smith, when he talked about the free market, he meant free from rent. And all this intermediation that Vera is talking about is rent.
Thank you. Minouche Shafiq, brief comment, please, on trade. Just a minute.
I am worried that if advanced economies reshore and nearshore more of manufacturing activity as a result of automation and concern about security of the supply chain, that may not be good for developing countries, because they will reshore production facilities at home markets. They'll produce for their home markets, but they'll also export to the rest of the world. And labor costs have become such a small part of production costs that they will be able to meet the needs of their own markets and the developing world. And that means that opportunity for growth might be lost to the developing world. So I think we need to think very hard about what's going to happen to the pattern of trade and supply chains and how to make sure developing countries don't get squeezed out.
Thank you very much indeed, Minouche. Leila Foury, just very briefly, because I really don't have much time. Thank you. Leila Foury, are you there?
Okay. Well, I think we've seen the deglobalization occurring as a result of Trump and the US engagement with China. COVID has exacerbated that. I think it's really important to ensure that there are multilateral agreements in place to protect the developing world. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is one step in that direction, and I think we need more.
Thank you very much indeed, Leila, and thank you. Sorry for squeezing you for time. Naila Kabir, your closing remarks, please, about trade or anything.
I was thinking about what Bogolo said about cross-border traders in Africa, and I was thinking about the women who work in the global value chains in Bangladesh. And what I find they have in common is violence. So I wonder if in all of this thinking about economic policy, we could give more consideration to questions of governance and rule of law, so that those who are engaging in trade in whatever form don't have to suffer the fear of violence.
Thank you very much indeed. And Kate Rayworth, your final remarks.
That we currently have very centralized, monopolized global supply chains. A company like Apple, which collects so much global value, and the example Vera gave was very powerful. In its returns, we have such a rise in billionaires as a result of these kinds of things. We need to go from this centralizing global supply chains to distributed global supply chains. So we need a circular economy where resources circulate locally and ideas move globally. This connects to Vera's point about local ability to generate power, Bogolo's point about distributed communication systems. We need global networks that stop the centralization of value in few hands that we currently have now.
Kate Rayworth, thank you very much indeed. That ends the contributions from our economists. We've enjoyed your props as well, which have underscored all the powerful points that you and your colleagues have made. I have not forgotten Antoinette Saye, but unfortunately she had to leave. I think I've included everybody in these final remarks. So, listening to all this, we have two grand dames, as it were. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is going to give us a few minutes of reflections on what she has heard. Of course, she's a former Minister of Finance of her native Nigeria, and she's also had a 25-year career at the World Bank as a development economist, culminating as MD of operations, and she's now currently an AU Special Envoy to mobilize international economic support for the continental fight against COVID-19. So, Ngozi, please give us, in a few minutes, your closing reflections on everything you've heard. You know, where have you been struck by the iconoclasm, the innovative thinking by your fellow female economists?
Hello, Zeinab. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you. It's been a really refreshing and electric session. And I think it's an impossible task that you set for those at the end to try to pull this together. You know, I can't even gather my thoughts. So I'll just share a few things. This is unfair. But I think we've got really brilliant comments and ideas. I'll just share what I think a few common threads. Let's start from the beginning. Why are we saying all this? Why are we here? We need to pull it back to the issue of vulnerability, poor people, practicality of whether what we're doing and saying in this world really reaches them, whether the suggestions that we're making reaches them and enables us to support countries to reach the SDGs. So I just want to bring us back to the beginning of this. The Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General said, this is about making sure that countries in the end achieve the 2030 agenda. So the question I had is, everything we're saying or I've heard, how does it impact the common man or the common woman, I should say, we're all women. So let me start. From the threads I could get, I think everybody agrees that injustice, inequality, and imbalance was there prior to the COVID. And the COVID came and exacerbated these injustices and shed more light on this. And COVID has also shown how interconnected and vulnerable the world is, and how much we need to cooperate and work in solidarity to be able to get out of our problems. Yet, as Caroline said, this is precisely what we are lacking at this moment. There is no solidarity such as we had during the global financial crisis and the food crisis, where Gordon Brown was instrumental in getting the G20 to come up with a plan that essentially had coordinated responses that rescued the world from the crisis. Now we don't have that. We have a retreat. The issue of finance, the issue to help poor countries to do better. It's not a question of finance. There's a lot of finance. Everybody agrees on that. But where the finance is going is not the right place. You know, it's going back into the financial sector, not hitting the ordinary woman and man, not getting to less developed countries or least developed countries where it's needed. And so that's, in a way, big injustice. This lack of finance being available, the mere fact that people will pay Germany to hold its bonds. You know, you have negative rates of interest, meaning that people are willing to pay Germany. And yet for emerging markets and developing countries, you have double-digit yields on their bonds, 10%, 12% for countries in Africa like Ghana and Nigeria. Something is wrong there. And that is why this cycle of debt keeps going. And what's the problem? When you try to talk of debt relief, countries are even afraid. As an envoy for the AU, charged with putting together additional financial resources for the continent, one of the things we are working on, including with Vera and the ECA, is this issue of debt relief, debt standstill. Countries are afraid to even come up to ask for this because they will be downgraded by the ratings agencies. We didn't even talk about that. There are some instruments in this world, some agents carrying on business as usual. And those are rating agencies in a business as unusual world during this pandemic. As long as we have them, we will not be able for countries to get the relief that they need, the resources that they need. Let me just give you one number.
Yes.
If African countries could get relief from their debts, there would be $44 billion more in their hands, which they could use to buy medical supplies and equipment to recover from the economic stress that they're in, which we all agree is going to be long-standing. If they could do that, just think about that, $44 billion. And we are saying that the gap for African countries of the resources they need now is about 100 to 114 billion. So that's a very sizable sum. The third thing I want to say is trade.
Yes.
Trade should be made to work better. Again, for the service of those at the bottom end of the ladder for poor countries. This issue of reshoring that Minush referred to, we need to, and countries becoming more nationalistic, moving away from just in time to just at home, isn't going to work. We need to find a way to make sure we don't go protectionist, but give developing countries a chance to develop their own value chains, like Vera said. That's what it's all about. How do we create value in our countries, create jobs, and not export jobs outside? So these are some of the things. If we can stick to some of the innovative thinking that has come on, think about people, think about the planet, think about poor people, think about creating value in our own countries. And by the way, we needed to talk a little bit more about what countries will do for themselves. We didn't spend some time on that.
We'll do that next time.
If we pull all this together, then I think we are getting to a situation where we can talk about sustainability and how to make living standards rise in our countries, how to prevent countries from getting into debt. So let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Ngozi, for giving us all that and filling in some of the holes as well. Thank you. We also have, I'd like to invite some more reflections from another a distinguished lady, Alicia Barchena, who's Executive Secretary of the UN's Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, previously served as the UN Under-Secretary General for Management at the UN headquarters in New York, comes from Mexico originally. Alicia, give us your takeaways and reflections on what you've heard today.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's very difficult to make a synthesis, but I will try with some thoughts. First of all, rebirthing the global economy with the lens of inclusion and sustainability has a woman's face. They are key actors how to rebuild back better with sustainability and equality. Developing countries and emerging economies in particular are facing historic inequalities and structural deficiencies, and they are facing a perfect storm and an existential crisis. Worst is behind and the hardest yet to come. So we need to agree internationally on key principles: digital over physical, green ahead of everything else, solidarity as a priority, actively impede asymmetric recovery. This is not a banking crisis, but one of people. And money has translated into a dislocation from real economy. We need, first of all, Sina, we need to recognize that this crisis is a systemic one and cannot be handled in a case-by-case pattern as the private creditors want to do. We cannot afford that. This requires a concerted way to redefine the international financial architecture. The future is very uncertain. The crisis will take longer. So we need to think carefully because people are going to emerge being more poor, unequal, hungry, and angry. So we need to include, for example, regulation on credit agencies. I heard that from some of you. And we also need to make sure that 10% of the resources of the global economy go to the recovery, as the SG said. And we have to avoid these asymmetries because developing countries have access that is high price, more costly than the developed world. DSSI is a good start, but much is needed. Let me talk a little bit about financing, direction of finance. I think this was essential. Financial as means and not an end in itself. Money should be carefully spent, and we have to rethink public policy. Let me say that I love what Mariana Mazzucato said, which resonates with Vera in terms of we have to link financing with industrial policies, with industrial strategies, with a profound transformation. So we need conditionalities, but good conditionalities, by the way, not austerity conditionalities, but we need to reduce, for example, materialization, as she said, but also to avoid this way of, like, for example, Denmark has been doing and not going the money to tax havens, for example. And we need to pursue reforms on education, health, and quality. Let me come in with a very important reflection that was not really not consensus around it, but I come from Latin America and I believe very much on cash transfers, by the way. We were able to get out of poverty 66 million people in a decade, not only because of cash transfers, also because of jobs. But cash transfers are important, and I think we should look at it. And the other thing is, how do we invest not in the inertial infrastructure, as was said here, but really in the grassroots economy? And for example, on the care economy, we haven't touched upon that, but women's economy is very, very important. And finally, how do we transform institutions, expand partnerships? And the role of multilateral institutions are crucial. We were talking now about the WTO. We need to govern trade, and we need definitely to create value regionally and domestically. And to do that, we need really to focus, yes, on imports and exports, but we have to have a fairer trade mechanism. It cannot be that we, the developing countries, export basic and raw materials, and those are processed in the developed countries. This is the classical periphery center paradigm. We have to get out of that, and we have to reset capitalism and provide direction to financing, to debt, and to also to trade. We need to create real value rather than paper value. I love that from Vera. And let me just say that we have to recognize in the first place that this is a systemic crisis, and it includes the ecological debt. Thank you so much to Kate Raworth with her donut. And just finally, let me say that we're not going to get out of this with austerity. We're going to get with a new trade environment that takes away the intermediaries and how to reduce the costs in the developing world. Sorry that I went very fast.
Great, thank you.
Because my region was not represented here, but I just have to make an appeal for the Caribbean countries, because the Caribbean countries, the service debt of the Caribbean countries is over 40% of the government revenue. This is not possible. The Caribbean countries need debt relief, haircuts, and real serious looking into their climate vulnerability. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much indeed, Alicia Barchena, for that rallying cry to action there and reminding us about the Caribbean and how that hasn't featured as much as it should have in our discussions today. Well, what an incredible lineup of voices there, some of the most incredible minds working in this field of economics and public policy. Well, let me go back to our co-conveners for some very, very brief closing remarks. You threw down the challenge, and I think that our female economists admirably rose to that. Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance of Indonesia, just a minute or so, please, your closing remarks. Were you impressed?
Not about what need to be done, or in this case, identifying the problem. The question is how we are going to address that one. Financing, debt, and trade. I think many of you talking about conditionality, and one which is missing is the ownership of each country to do this kind of thing. You cannot impose conditionality from the financing sector or from the creditors and so on. we have a lot of evidence it's not going to be sustainable. So how you are going to create strong ownership and ability to deliver those reform? I think we didn't discuss about that. So if you want to have this kind of reform, what kind of incentive, whether this is on a political system, democratic, non-democratic system, on a market mechanism, this is what we haven't discussed yet on that area, which need to be done. We discussed quite a lot about the importance of cooperation at the global level. How we are going to discuss at this very moment, I mean, when all this partnership and cooperation is evaporated, I mean, there is no leadership. So the question is about how. What is wrong and how, for example, the existing multilateral institution, whether this is UN, World Bank, IMF, or other regional, can actually create this kind of cooperation, leadership. Is there any major country who can provide, whether G20 can become a platform? I don't know, but this is exactly lacking of leadership. And there is no really cooperation, and there is no way that there is no common ground or common objective that is shared at the country level, at the leaders level. I think this is what is lacking. The third one is, I think, when we are talking about the reform on this multilateral institution, who should do that? In my experience in the bank, when we did this reform, I think this is the shareholder and membership, they both want the reform. So it is then delivered, whether this is on an internal institutional business process or budgeting or human the human resource management, yes, or in terms of lending and so on. So there is pressure from both. So I think, Zeinab, what I'm saying is that we talk a lot about the problems, identifying very well, but the how is maybe the most important. This is maybe for the next meeting. Thank you so much.
We couldn't do it all in a couple of hours. You're quite right, Minister, but we've certainly set some thinking amongst us all. And you're quite right, this is just the first in a series of roundtables, we hope. So to you, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, did our women economists start making in a different way?
This has been amazing. Thank you, Zeinab. And thank you to all the ladies, my sisters. What can I say? It's, what do you say, what you don't say? It's like going into a sweet shop with sort of 5p and you can't choose. What you did for me as a non-economist, which means speaking to the world, you brought clarity to the can-do. And you showed us in this window of opportunity that we can actually take the leadership and get on with it. And I think, listening to the different perspectives is exactly what we wanted, was that can we pick up the gauntlet and get out the door to shape what needs to be shaped as we looked at the financial architecture, both locally and globally. And a lot of this has been done for us globally, but it has no connection to what is happening on the ground. It was great to hear Kate bring in what is an existential threat happening right now. And so when we think about the conditionalities, it's not conditionalities that are perverse, it's conditionalities that actually extend the life of the planet, but with people at the center. And I think that, that's really important. I heard about cash transfers and social protection programs. Look, I've always been about, let's not keep people just above death row. What we need for them to do is to survive and thrive. And all of that requires all the pieces that you brought into the conversation today. This has been done really within the frame of the meeting we've had on financing for development. And it's when I looked at it, apart from Ngozi, it was a man's world. And I was just thinking, this is about men and women. And what we need to do is to bring that leadership in and to begin to shape the future together. Now, if we're ahead of the curve, which it appears so from this conversation, so be it. And so this series is about doing just that, just profiling, convening, and getting all the voices of women out there to shape a better world for us. The next in the series will go to young people, because that's the intergenerational transfer that must happen. If that transition doesn't happen, then we're stuck in the old ways. We have an opportunity 75 years after the UN to say something different and more responsive to the world as it is and as it will be. So I think it's for me, fantastic. We look forward to you continuing to participate and to support, particularly the next discussion, which will take on young economists, women economists, and that will be in the context of the General Assembly just after that, where we have a finance ministers meeting around the world, and hopefully that will feed that discussion. we will end up at the end of the year with what I would say a surprising debate. And I hope that you will all come back and join that, because then we will show that this world is about men and women just as equal and able to take up leadership on getting us out of this crisis and ensuring that we do in fact recover better. So thank you so much. It's been fantastic. We had two wonderful women who really supported this, and I just want to give them a shout out because I didn't have to ask twice. One was Natalia Kanem, who is the head of UNFPA, and the other, of course, was Ahuna, our regional director in UNDP for Africa. So thank you so much. We discussed issues, we went beyond regions, and we went beyond the politics of many things to talk about people, our planet, prosperity, peace, and the partnerships we need to succeed. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Secretary General, and to reiterate your thanks to UNFPA and UNDP for making this all possible. This is just the start, it's just the beginning. And when we talk about sustainable and inclusive development, of course, that debate has got to be a global conversation and one that is inclusive. And we salute your leadership too, Deputy Secretary General. Thank you also to our co-convener, the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, and to the Secretary General who launched this series. It's been my pleasure to have engaged in this conversation with our wonderful women economists from all over the world. Thank you also to Christine Lagarde and Kristalina Georgieva for their warm words of support at the beginning. Thank you all very much indeed from me, Zeinab Badawi. It's been my pleasure rebirthing the global economy with all of you. Till the next time, goodbye. Thank you.